Hey YouTube, Common Collector here, and today I am finally bringing you guys my Dogmatica Invoked Shadal deck profile. So I actually ended up pulling this Dogmatica Ecclesia Starlight rare back when Rise of the Duelist first came out, and it's taken me a while to get really comfortable with this deck and want to, and to get the extra deck to where I really wanted it, as well as the side deck, because that's generally where the variation for these decks come from. The main deck is pretty solid across the board and not too much variation, and then when you get to the extra deck and especially the side deck is where you're going to see some changes. But before we get on into the deck profile, I really just want to say lastly, guys, thank you very much for hitting 1,000 subscribers. That just happened a few days ago, and I really appreciated it. Sorry I haven't been getting out as many videos as usual this last week, but things in my personal life and work and stuff has just been really busy. But thank you guys very much for 1,000 subs, and now let's finally get on into this Dogmatica deck profile. So starting off here with 3 copies of Ecclesia the Virtuous. So Ecclesia is basically your starter card for at least the Dogmatica side of things. So you have your Invoked engine, and then you have your Dogmatica engine. So what Ecclesia does is that it can't be destroyed by battle by a monster special summon from the extra deck. And then also, if there is a monster that is on the field from the extra deck, you can just special summon this card right onto the field, whether it's your opponent or you that has the monster. And then when this card is normal or special summoned, you're able to add another Dogmatica card from your deck to your hand. And then for the rest of the turn, you can't special summon from the extra deck. A lot of the Dogmatica cards have sort of stipulations that restrict you from the extra deck, but it's really not that, that stringent on the deck. All you do is you really just sort of save your Dogmatica effects for the end of your turn and get all of your invoked stuff off at the beginning of the turn. I've noticed in a lot of deck profiles for this that there's not very a good way that the people doing the deck profiles have been very descriptive. So I'm going to try to make this a very in-depth deck profile so you guys can actually understand what these cards do and how they synergize and why these 2 archetypes, technically 3 archetypes, are sort of melded together. Then we're going on into 2 copies of Maximus. This is where people sort of differ in their decks, so a lot of people just play 1. Some people even play 3. I like playing just the 2 Maximus because you actually don't ever care if you just hard draw into this. It's actually a very nice top deck, in my opinion. So I actually was at Locals this last week, and I top decked this at least once, and it helped save me the game. But what Maximus does is that you special summon it to the field by banishing a extra deck monster from your graveyard, and then when this card is on the field once per turn, you can send 2 monsters with different names from your extra deck, and then your opponent does the same thing. They don't have to have monsters with different names, but you both send 2 monsters from the extra deck to the graveyard, and then basically the way that this deck works is that it likes pitching things to the graveyard with Maximus and by other effects, and you just get a lot of advantage off from that, and we'll get more into that once we get to the actual extra deck. Then we go on into 2 copies of Fleur de Lis. It's basically like a hand trap effect veiler for the deck, and it's super searchable in this deck. So you only need the 2 copies of this. It's a great searcher off of your Ecclesia, as well as one of the cards in the extra deck. But what Ecclesia does is that if there's a monster that is special summoned from the extra deck on the field, you can special summon this card as a quick effect and then negate the effect of one of the monsters that is special summoned from the extra deck. So it's just really nice just to get a big body onto the field. And then also, when your Dogmatica monsters declare an attack, this card can increase the attack of all of your Dogmaticas by 500, which actually is not until the end of the turn, so it's actually permanent. So this deck actually does have a really good matchup against like any kind of Red Eyes Dark Dragoon turbo decks. So what you basically do is you can bait out the Dragoon's negate effect, get this card out onto the field, increase it up to 3,000 with its own effect, and just attack and suicide there. Otherwise, if there are actually a few other effects that you can use to get rid of Dark Dragoon as well, that's just one of your simple options. Then getting on into Alistar the Invoker. Obviously, if we're playing the Invoked engine, we want to be playing 3 copies of this. So what this card does is that when it's normal summoned, then you add 1 copy of Invocation from your deck to your hand. Also when it's flipped face up, which doesn't come up too often, but actually it did come up in a grind game that I was doing up against Numeron Zexel. So basically I had it set, got flipped, and I was still actually able to add the Invocation because it was on my opponent's turn. So it is actually kind of nice that that is one of its effects. Then going on into some hand traps, we got to be playing 3 copies of Ash Blossom. This is basically the best control deck of the format right now, so we want to be playing a plethora of hand traps. So we have the Ash, the Effect Veiler. I would never drop the Effect Veiler, especially not in this format, because Effect Veiler is super good for negating like your Verte Anaconda in order to make sure your opponent does not go into the Dragoon. Then you've got 3 copies of Sci-Frame Gear Gamma and 1 copy of Sci-Frame Driver. I was really cautious about adding this into the deck, and I didn't like it at first, but with some of the other cards that we play in this deck, this actually is really, really nice, because the downside to Sci-Frame Gear Gamma is that it ends up actually sort of piling up in your hand after a while. But that's not a big deal because we have a lot of discard effects in this deck, so you really don't have to worry about hard drawing into either of these cards, whether it's early or late game. Especially if you draw the Driver, you can just discard it, and then it's sitting in the graveyard, and then you can use Gamma's effect to just summon it from the graveyard anyways. Then we're going on into 3 copies of Magical Meltdown. This searches out your Alistar the Invoker. Also, while it's on the field, when you fusion summon, your opponents can't like respond to the fusion summon, which is really nice. Then just 1 copy of Terraforming to search out the Meltdown. I would never drop this either because we just need to really get into that Invoked engine as quickly as we can. So with this, you basically have 7 copies of your Alistar just to help you get into it. It's super consistent to get into. That's why I would just always keep that Terraforming. Then we have 2 copies of the Invocation. This is a card that you can keep at 2. You could put it to 3 if you really want to, but it's super searchable. And then, so basically what this does is it helps you to get your fusions out for the Invoked engine. And it can now also banish cards from your opponent's graveyard, which is super duper nice in case you don't have one of the attributes, because the Invoked engine generally relies on attributes as well as types like fusion monsters you need for your Aguaides. But besides that, if your opponent has, let's say, a fire monster in the graveyard and you don't have a fire, they're playing Salamangreat, then you just use the Invocation, banish their Balinks from the graveyard, and then use the Alistar the Invoker, and then you can go into your fire attribute of the invoked deck. From there, we're going to go on into 3 copies of Nadir Servant. So what Nadir Servant does is it is your best searcher for the Dogmatica archetype. So what you do is this will either it really searches whatever of the monsters that you need. Generally, I go for Ecclesia or Maximus, and then you have the Ecclesia or a recurring effect from after the Maximus to add like the Fleur-de-Lis to hand. But anyways, what Nadir Servant actually does is that it sends a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard, and then you add a specific Dogmatica monster that has attack that is less than or equal to the attack of the monster that you send. So say you're trying to pick up the Ecclesia, which has only 1500 attack, then you just send something that has 1500 or more to the graveyard, and then that helps you to search off that Ecclesia. And most of the monsters in our extra deck do have a pretty high attack. So then we're going on into 3 copies of Forbidden Droplet. So this is where like the budget is really, really getting pushed for the deck, because obviously already the Dogmatica cards are pretty spendy. But Forbidden Droplet, this is the reason why Sci-Frame Gear Gamma works so good in this deck, is because if you end up having a bunch of bricks that are in your hand, and then all of a sudden your opponent is going to try to push for their game, then you can just use Forbidden Droplet, negate all of your opponent's monsters' effects, and also cut their attacks in half for the turn. And it's just super nice. You get rid of all of those dead cards that start accumulating in your hand, which there are a couple that will start sort of accumulating depending on how grindy the game is getting. Then this is a card where you can kind of flip-flop between 2 or 3 of these, and again, pushing budget, but we have Triple Tactics Talent. Again, this is not a budget deck, so this is like for like the ultimate competitiveness. The only thing that's not competitive that that is competitive that I'm not playing in here is Lightning Storm, just because I never bought that. back in the day. I didn't think it was that great, and really these two cards, I was just glad that I picked them up back when these were cheap still. And then we're going on into 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence, and then 2 copies of the Dogmatica Punishment. Impermanence, super great in this deck because your opponent can't stop it with like Called by the Grave or like with their own copy of Gamma and whatnot, so it's just super nice in here. Then the Dogmatica Punishment, it works really similar to your Nadir Servant, but what this card does is that if your opponent has a monster on the field, you use this to send a monster from your extra deck to the graveyard, and then as long as the attack has to be higher or equal to the monster that your opponent has on the field, and then you destroy it. So it's just really nice for a little bit of spot removal. And then again, it helps you to set up the graveyard. Goes along with the whole theme of the Dogmaticas for pitching stuff into the graveyard and then getting bonus effects off of that. The only downside that you have to keep in mind with this is that it stops you from special summoning from the extra deck throughout your whole next turn, so just keep all of that in mind. And then for our final 40th card is 1 copy of the new Shaddoll Schism that came out in Rise of the Duelist. So this Shaddoll Schism card is just absolutely insane for the Shaddoll engine. Like, the fact that you only run 1 card for the whole Shaddoll engine in your main deck is just nuts. And then all of the other Dogmatica cards just focus on getting the Shaddoll cards actually in the graveyard so that you can get the fusion summons off. So what Schism does is that you fusion summon using materials from your banishing materials from your field or graveyard, and then the monster cannot attack directly, which really isn't that big of a problem. But then also just keep in mind that with this, when you do get that summon off, then you send a monster that your opponent controls on the field to the graveyard, and this does not destroy, does not target, so it is super nice. This is just our other way that we can get rid of Red Eye's Dark Dragoon. So you just use this, the Schism, to go into your Shaddoll Winda, and then that is going to help you to just send your opponent's Dragoon right to the graveyard. So super nice. This deck is super consistent and super duper not budget, if you guys haven't been able to tell already. But now let's get on into the extra deck. So for the extra deck, there is a little bit of flexibility in here, but overall it is generally pretty consistent. We are obviously going to be starting off with the 1 copy of Almirage and the 1 copy of Secure Gardena. It seems a little bit odd, but basically why these are in here, if you get sort of a dead hand with a whole bunch of hand traps, or your main combo is with Alistar the Invoker, you summon your Alistar, get off your search for the Invocation, and since Invocation works from hand, field, or graveyard, you might as well set up a monster on board anyways, so you link off the Alistar for your Almirage, and then you link off the Almirage for your Secure Gardena, and then this means that you have an Alistar as well as a fire and a light attribute already in the graveyard, and then that just helps with your invocation plays. So for the actual invoked cards, we were playing 1 copy of the Mechaba. This is 1 card where I could see it going to 2 in the extra deck, but I'm only playing the 1. So what this card does is it requires your Alistar as well as a light monster, so you're generally sending your Secure Gardena, or if you're able to get off that Effect Veiler in your hand, then that's also nice just to set that up in the graveyard. That's why the hand traps in this deck are super, super important. But anyways, what your Mechaba does is that once per turn, whenever a spell trap or monster effect is activated, you can send the same kind of card from your hand to the graveyard and then negate that effect and also banish the card, which is super nice. Again, just sort of another way to negate like your opponent's Red Eye's Dark Dragoon and just any other problem cards. Then my favorite of the Invoked engine, not the best, but actually just my favorite for style points, is Invoked Aguides. So this card requires your Alistar as well as a fusion monster, and you're generally going to have your graveyard set up with a bunch of fusion monsters. So what Aguides does is that once he is special summoned, and whenever your opponent special summons a monster, once per turn, obviously, you're able to destroy 1 monster on the field. So it's just super nice if your opponent, is just starting off their play. They have their 1 combo starter then you just destroy it right away, and then bam, they've got nothing on the field already. And if they're not playing a super aggressive deck like Dragon Link, that could be game over for them right there. So Aguaides is just super great for control. Then also he can juice up his attack by banishing another fusion monster from your graveyard, which is super duper nice. Then we're going to go on into one copy of Invoked Purgatrio. He's basically in here for if you're going into time or something like that, and or if your opponent has a bunch of piddly little weak monsters and you just want to bash into all of them and do the end of the game damage that you need. This is your guy. So it gains 200 attack for each card your opponent controls. Now note that's each card, not just each monster, so that's super nice. And then it can attack each monster that your opponent controls. So that's just really nice for just getting some extra damage in and hopefully cleaning out the game right there. One copy of Invoked Caliga. So while this card's on the field, both players can only attempt to activate one monster effect per turn, which is super great against the top two decks right now, which is like Dino and Dragon Link, as well as like even Infernoble Knight, which is a big heavy monster deck. So just keep in mind that your Invoked Caliga is going to be able to shut down a lot of those decks. And we play a lot of darks in the deck. We play a lot of lights, fire, and fusion. So all of these cards are always super accessible whenever. And then also while this card's on the field, each player can only attack with one monster during the battle phase. So basically if you get Caliga and your Aguaides next to each other, it's basically game over because only one monster can attack and he can get really, really high. And then also like one monster effect per turn, so you can just blow up whatever monster they summon. It's just crazy. Then for our Shaddoll engine, one copy of Winda. Each player can only special summon once per turn. Again, along with the Caliga, this card just cripples all of the big combo decks right now. One Apkallone. So what Apkallone does for the deck is that when this card is sent to the graveyard, which you are going to send to the graveyard with either your Nadir Servant or your Maximus. So what this card does when it hits the graveyard is it adds your Shaddoll Schism from your deck into your hand, and then you have to discard a card. So if you're at the point where you still want to keep everything else in your hand, you just send the Schism to the graveyard, and then you use your, if this was off Nadir Servant, you then use your Maximus to send your Construct to the graveyard. When Construct hits the graveyard, that's going to add your Schism back into your hand. Otherwise, if you actually do have a good discard target for the Apkallone, then you just add this, discard off of Apkallone, and that way you have your Schism in hand, and then you keep the Construct and Winda for options in your extra deck. That's the version that I prefer, but if you're backed into a corner and you don't want to discard anything, then you just go Nadir Servant, discard this, and yeah, it all just works really well. This is why everything just synergizes super, super well. Then we have the one Titaniclad, the Ash Dragon. So you are never going to fusion summon this because we don't play Fallen of Albaz from the Dogmatica archetype. But what this card does is that when this card hits the graveyard, during the end phase, you're able to add any Dogmatica card from your deck to your hand, which is just amazing. I would almost try to bump this or Winda to 2 copies, but the extra deck is just super tight in this, as well as the Mechaba. These are my 3 cards that I kind of teeter around if I want to bump either of them up to 2, mainly because, like, especially with Winda, if you can get Winda to stick on board and then your opponent, if they're able to get over that, but yet you still have this Schism, keep in mind, Schism is a continuous trap card and it's during the main phase of either turn that you can do the fusion summoning. So if you would have 2 Windas in extra deck and your opponent blows up this first one, then you could technically use Schism again, as long as it's not on that same turn, and then go into a second copy of Winda, and then bam, you're back into the game, and your opponent is probably not going to have a way to get rid of a second Winda. It's super hard for any deck to get rid of 2 of those. So continuing on, we have 1 copy of Sci-Frame Lord Omega. Now we're getting, especially with the Titaniclad and the Sci-Frame, these are cards that you're sending off of your Nadir Servant, your Maximus, or your Dogmatica Punishment. So what this card does is you can actually synchro summon it with obviously your Sci-Frame cards, but when this card is sitting in your graveyard during your opponent's standby phase, you can take a banished card and then put it back into the graveyard. And then also during your turn, you can bounce this card back into the extra deck, as well as one other card that's sitting in the graveyard. So this is kind of nice with these three options, or really anything that you need. You can take the Omega as well as like your Winda, put them back into the extra deck, and then you have that card again as an option to either resummon, or if you just need to, you want to repitch the Titaniclad, you can go ahead and send it back and then send it to the graveyard again with like your Nadir Servant. Also, the Omega is really nice in here because it's the highest attack monster. So if you're sending something to grave for your punishment, this is actually going to be your highest attack target. I actually have seen people who have teched in like a Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, which has 4,500 attack. So if your opponent has like an Ultimate Conductor Tyranno on the field, then you can pitch the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon to the graveyard, and then you're going to be able to blow up whatever has like 4,500 attack on board. So really nice tech. There's just not enough room in the extra deck for me to do that. One copy of Wind Pegasus at Ignister. This is the one card that I could see coming out of here, but I really actually like it. So when this card is sitting in your graveyard, if your opponent destroys one of your monsters by battle or card effect, then you can banish this from the graveyard and bounce a card that your opponent has on the field. So really nice just for a little bit of spot removal. Then your other sleeper card that's going to be sleeping in your graveyard for whenever you need it is your Fossil Warrior Skull Knight. So what this card is going to do is that you can banish it from the graveyard during your turn, and then you can destroy one monster on the field, which is just super nice just for a little extra spot removal. And then finally, 2 copies of the Elder Entity Natis. I really like having the 2 copies in here, but again, this could be your one card to take out in order to fit in a second Winda, a second Mechaba, or another Titaniclad. So, but keep in mind, again, with the Maximus that you have to send monsters with different card names. So you can send like your Elder Entity Natis and your Titaniclad to the graveyard. Natis is going to pop a card, and then at the end phase, Titaniclad is going to get you back into your Dogmatica engine. So that's going to do it for the extra deck. And as I said, the side deck is where things really start to sort of change between decks. This is just sort of what I came up with this last weekend when I was at Locals. So obviously we want to be playing the Harpies, Feather Duster, and either 1 or 2 copies of Cosmic Cyclone. The only matchup that I actually lost to this last weekend was Mystic Mine, paired with Gren Maju and Numeron. So I really want to keep these cards in here in case I go up against something like that. I'll probably never take these cards out ever again because that was such an embarrassing matchup. I took out everything else that I went up against, but I just could not get around the Mystic Mine. Then obviously for combo, we want to be playing 3 copies of Nibiru, and then one card that could possibly come out is the 3 copies of Evenly Matched. I'm not sure how I feel about this right now, but Evenly Matched is still always good against combo. Then if you're still having a tough time getting around stuff like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon and other stuff that just puts out big boss monsters, again, this is good for the Numeron matchup, is 3 copies of Gamma Seal. Everyone should be playing Kaijus in their side deck, in my opinion, right now, just because it's a great way to get around Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. And speaking of one other way, just because I'm super paranoid about Dragoon and just any other decks, you know, this Ice Dragon's Prison is just so good against a lot of decks right now. But anyways, guys, that is going to do it for the deck. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about Invoked, Shaddoll, Dogmatica. It's been a lot of fun playing around with this deck. I've really been enjoying it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the deck profile, and if you guys can't afford this, just go ahead and check this out on like YGO Pro or wherever you guys are playing Dueling Book. Like, this deck is a lot of fun just to mess around with, and it's a super, super consistent control deck. Unfortunately, this is better than Evil Eye, so I am playing with this deck right now over my Evil Eye deck, which I still love. But yeah, this deck really can really kick some ass. I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys pick it up. Anyways, guys, Common Collector out. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe. Later.